This video describes how to use the ER Studio team server integration with Collibra. So the objective here is to allow data architects using ER Studio to work hand in hand with the data stewards and really contribute value to the data governance project. So we've got four objectives here. The first, we want to be able to configure the integration through some settings. We don't want to have to code up REST interfaces. I want to do it all through a nice UI. We're then going to allow you to synchronize the business terms, the business glossaries of Collibra and Team Server. So they're the same in both. So wherever you go in either of the tools, you're going to get the same information. The third step, we're then going to allow you to map those terms to ER objects. And then the fourth, we can then publish the models with those ER objects back to Collibra along with all the mappings. So before we go on, as you're all aware, ER Studio has three components to it. We've got Data Architects, the thick client tool. So we've done a lot of work in version 19 to allow you to attach business terms to ER objects. We've then got the Team Server repository in the center holding all the models, and then we've got Team Server Core, the web interface to ER Studio. And this is where the integration with Collibra lies. So if you've got Team Server Core and Enterprise Team Edition, then you have access to the Collibra integration. And we've built the integration against the Collibra REST-based API. So if you're running Collibra on-premise or through the cloud, as long as the Team Server Core server has access to the Collibra server, then great, off you go. It connects to the Collibra REST API and you're away. So the objective overall is to have three sets of models and be able to link them together. So top left hand corner we've got the green, which is our business glossary. So we want to build a business glossary of terms, and we want to go from a simple flat list of terms ideally to an ontology. So we want to arrange those terms into hierarchies or taxonomies, and then we want to relate terms together, whether a term is an attribute of another term or just simply related. So we want to capture that sort of information and use that within Collibra to be able to browse the business glossaries and find information. The other two models at the bottom, we've got our traditional logical data models. So this is a valuable source of knowledge to be able to kickstart a data governance initiative. So if your data architecture team has been working for a long time to build out some good logical data models, then there's opportunities to harvest business terms and relationships between those terms from those models. And again, in version 19 of ER Studio, we've got some tools to be able to harvest that sort of information. And then on the right hand side, we've got the physical models of the data assets. So as we reverse engineer databases or files, we'll have a physical representation of the schema of that asset, usually in technical language. And we want to be able to map that to both the logical data models and onto the business terms so that we can understand what is this data in this particular data asset, what rules applies to it, etc. We want to be able to go from our business terms in the Collibra catalog and say, well, where is this data? So in this example, where have I got client information, which data assets contains it? So before we move on, let's look at the Metamodels of the two tools. So on the left hand side we have ER Studio's Metamodel for the business glossary. So over on the left we've got glossary objects, and then we can namespace business terms into those glossaries, and then the business terms themselves have relationships between them. Over on the right hand side we have the Collibra Metamodel. It's slightly different. So Collibra has the concept of communities, and you can have a hierarchy of communities, and then domains, and the domains are namespace to those communities with those red lines. And domains of type glossary we want to be able to map to the glossaries in Team Server. And in Collibra you've then got business terms, which are namespace to those domains. And then there are some out-of-the-box some relationships in Collibra between the terms. And most Collibra customers are in creating their own relationships between business terms. So when we get onto the demo, you're going to be able to see how we can map the objects. The objects are already mapped, the relationships between the business terms to ER Studio relationships. And likewise the properties. So we want to provide flexibility for you on that mapping. On the data model side, so logical data models, similar sort of thing. So over on the left hand side we've got ER Studio. We've got diagrams that contain a logical model, and we can have submodels. The entities are then namespace to the model, and the attributes namespace to the entities. And then we can map those onto business terms. Collibra, slightly different again. So we've got our communities and our domains, and we have domains of type logical data dictionary. Within a domain of type logical data dictionary, out of the box, Collibra provides you with the notion of a data model object, and then data entities and data attributes. And all of those are namespace to the domains. So within our integration, you'll find that we're naming, so entities, attributes have a name, a short name, and then a fully qualified name. So we're building a fully qualified name. So for instance, an attribute will have the attribute name and the entity name, and we have a little convention that we use for the naming of that. And then we apply the short name for you to be able to view the name of the attributes. And again, we want to map the two sides together. And then the last model, the physical data model, ER Studio. So we have diagrams containing physical data models, and we can have multiple physical data models. The model then has a schema, table, column. Collibra, we've got our community, then a domain of type physical data dictionary. And in a physical data dictionary, you can have systems, databases, schemas, tables, and columns. And you can map tables and columns to business terms. All of those objects are namespace to the domain. So again, we're using a naming convention for the fully qualified name. So it'll be schema with a delimiter, table, delimiter, column. And then we map the two sides across. And it's worth mentioning in this release that we're not mapping anything to systems and databases in Collibra. We're only bringing across schemas, tables, and columns. So the steps we're going to go through now, we're first of all going to set up the link to Collibra. And then we're going to talk about how we set up the mastering. So whether Collibra is the master for terms or team server is, and we can define whether Collibra is the master for properties and or relationships between the terms. So we're trying to build in flexibility into the integration. Another step, simple one, is when we display the URLs between the two tools. We want to be able to hop from one tool to another. So in Collibra, we want to have an optional field to say, open this term or this object inside Team Server. And when we're in Team Server and we see a term, we want to be able to say, open this in Collibra. And you can specify the link text there. And then last one is how do we synchronize the glossaries? So we can specify a synchronization frequency. So we periodically poll Collibra, see what's changed, and then update both sides. So let's see how we set this up in Team Server. We've included a new menu item with all the Collibra administration settings in here. And to enable this, then we need to go to our permissions in our admin. And you can see here we can assign a new feature to different groups, so the ability to see the Collibra administration tab. Once we've got that tab, then we can come to My Settings Collibra and we get these settings pages here. First thing to do is to set up the link. So we take the URL of our Collibra instance, we paste it into host, we give an admin username and password, and we test the connection. Once we've tested the connection, then we can set up the mastering. So we decide if terms are created in Collibra or Team Server, do we pass them to Collibra? If they're created in Collibra, do we pass them to Team Server? You can set it up so that no terms are passed or all new terms are passed. And then the master for changes. So when there's changes to the properties of terms, do we make Collibra the master or Team Server? And likewise for the relationships. Next section is linking between the tools. So for a term in either tool, so they should be identical, and we want to be able to hop from one tool to another. So we can apply a label inside Team Server, open in Collibra, and you can change the text for that. Likewise, you can create a new property in Collibra, and we call the property here the default ER Studio URL, and within that property there'll be a little bit of text that's hyperlinked back to Team Server. Next part is the scheduling frequency. So you can set up the time in minutes. How often does the integration go and check for new terms or changes? And that's in minutes. Default 0, so it's not going to synchronize at all until you set a value. And then there's some status values. When was the last sync executed? Once you've got all the settings just how you like, then apply the changes. Notice also there's a sync now button at the bottom, so you can manually sync business terms. The next stage is to map which Collibra properties map to which Team Server properties. Now, we don't have to map every property. One system might have information that the other system isn't interested in. In our property mapping, we currently only support 2 of the 3 property systems, and there's potentially a fourth one as well. We've built in, and we'll look at this in a moment, a new custom property system in Team Server to make it easier to build new custom properties. We also have the built-in properties for objects. There's then two more property systems on top. There's the managed attributes in Team Server, which are created from the data dictionaries, and then we've also got attachments inside data architects. So against ER objects you can attach properties. There's a little bit more complexity to those two, so we haven't put it into the first release. We also have an ability to auto map. So for every property in Collibra we can create a new custom property in Team Server against terms and different objects, and then automatically map those Collibra properties to the newly created terms. So let's go and have a look. So the first thing we're going to look at is the new custom property system. So in the past with Team Server, if we wanted to add new properties to objects, then we come here to managed attributes, and the process was quite long. So you'd have to go into data architects, create at least one enterprise data dictionary, and then create attachments in the data dictionary, and those attachments you can then connect to different object types as custom properties. So what we've done is we've added a new simplified system. These custom properties here, it really is easy. So all you do now is you click create new custom property. You can set the data type, make this one a text. You can add a default value if you like, and then save it. Once it's saved, you can then add it to different object types. So my custom property, there it is, it's now added to the business term, and that's now available for us to map through Collibra. Now it's worth mentioning that in the first version we're only supporting these custom properties to allow you to map to Collibra. These managed attributes will be in a future release. There's also the attachments, when attach them directly to ER objects, they're coming in a future release as well. So at the moment, try and use these custom properties on all the object types if you want to synchronize with Collibra. So now we can map our custom properties to our Collibra properties. So if we go to our Collibra settings pages, we've got property mappings here, and for each of the object types that we're going to synchronize with Collibra, we can choose against each of the Collibra properties which Team Server property we want to map, and we can do it manually. So here, descriptive example, I've got a little drop down. All the properties that are of the right data type and suitable to map are listed here. So I'll map a descriptive example, and my custom property, do the same thing there. We can also then auto create properties. So hitting this button will actually generate new properties. Once you've mapped all your properties, you hit save and job done. Okay, so we've mapped our Collibra properties to our Team Server properties. Again, worth mentioning, we only support for the Collibra mapping the new custom properties and built-in properties of the ER objects. And we also quickly saw that there is an auto mapping facility. So the next step is to map relationships. So we want to see the relationships between business terms mapped to Collibra business terms. Now we've taken into account the hierarchical nature of Collibra. So you can build relationships from asset to asset, from asset to business asset, asset to business term, and any combination of these. So we look at all those possible relationships and allow you to map them to the standard out-of-the-box relationships within Team Server. So let's go and have a look at that. So we're going to go to our business terms relationship mapping. Again, all of the relationships that business terms can have in Collibra are presented here in a list. I've got a couple of pages of them. As you can see, we've been creating some relationships to test the integration. And you go through and you choose from the out-of-the-box Team Server relationships you want to map to them. So groups, we might say attribute of, relates to, synonym of, is type of. We created a relationship here, and you can flip the direction. So we've got to make sure that the direction is right. So if we do that, then you can see it changes the direction here. So groups has attributes of, grouped by is attribute of. So let's save those mappings. So we've got all our basic settings done for the business terms. So the next stage is to decide which Collibra domains we want to map to which Team Server glossaries. So let's go and have a look. So in our domain section of our Collibra settings, we've now got a drop down of all of the communities and domains available in Collibra. If I go and find the one that I want to use. So we're going to choose Human Resources, My HR Glossary. And I can just simply choose the glossary I want to map to, Human Resources to Human Resources. Then make a decision on which terms do we want to synchronize. So there might be a lot going on through the processes and the workflows in Collibra. So these are all the different statuses that your Collibra instance has. And you can choose to say, okay, I want to synchronize every change that's made within Collibra back to Team Server. You might say, okay, well, only bring me cross changes if the term is at status of approved. And then the last thing is to decide, okay, I've mapped them. Now I want to choose, will they be synchronized or not? And then save. So that's all our mappings now set up. And then the last part is we can actually execute the synchronization process. So looking at our glossary in Team Server, Human Resources, at the moment I can see I've got no terms in there. Already, because we've mapped it, it's got the little link here opened in Collibra. If I actually click on that, and here is that glossary with all the terms in it. If we start the synchronization, so I'm going to go back to Settings, General. Now this is where I can choose to set a synchronization frequency in minutes, or I can do a manual sync. So we'll do a manual sync right now and let it run. And depending on how many terms you've got in your glossary will determine how long it'll take. So if you've got hundreds of thousands, it might take some hours on the first run. So that's now complete. If we go back to our glossary and refresh, there's all our terms from Collibra. And again, each one has got an open Collibra link, and I can hop across, see the same term inside Collibra. And depending on your scenario, you might want to experiment with the mastering settings. So it might be that you want to harvest your first set of business terms from your corporate logical model. So the new version 19 features where you can harvest both the business terms and the relationships between those terms. You could then push them to Collibra and then make Collibra the master and then receive updates from Collibra. In the next section, we're going to look at how we can publish our data models from ER Studio into Collibra. And the steps are as follows. So like we did with our business terms, we'll first map the properties of ER objects onto Collibra objects. And then we're going to map individual logical and physical data models onto Collibra domains. We can use the standard logical data dictionary and physical data dictionary domains in Collibra. And the last stage is we decide on how to synchronize the models. So we can manually synchronize, or we can choose to semi-automatically synchronize the models. So as a user of Data Architect publishes a data model to the Team Server repository, as soon as it is published in Team Server, then we can allow the synchronization operation to occur automatically. So let's go and have a look at it. So again, here we are in the Collibra Integration section. We're in property mappings. And for each of our ER object types, we can set the property mappings. So here we've got Collibra property description mapped to a built-in description of definition. So you go through and you map all the types. Now there may be some data mismatches. So for instance, in Collibra, you can set a Boolean property type for foreign key or primary key, and in Team Server it's a text field. So you might have to create new properties inside Collibra. The next step is to map the models. So here in Model Publishing, Model Selection, you can see all your Team Server models. On page 2 here, I've mapped my HR database, migrating from SQL Server to Snowflake. I've got a logical model, and then I've got 2 physical models. I've mapped my logical model to the Collibra community demo, and then I've chosen the Collibra domain HR training DB logical data models. And I've selected this to publish as soon as I publish from ER Studio. So if I make any change in Data Architects, publish it to the Team Server repo, that publishing happens automatically. I've got that setting switched on, and then automatically again, it then gets published to Collibra based on this. Alternatively, I can leave it to manual. I can check the little box and then hit publish, and it will then publish manually to Collibra. And then likewise on the physical model, I've got a Snowflake database. I've mapped to HR training DB physical model, and as soon as that publish operation occurs, I can then hop across to Collibra, and I can see these are my 2 data dictionaries. So I've got a logical data dictionary and a physical data dictionary, and we go into each of these. So there's our logical. I've got a hierarchical view here. So there's employee and all of its attributes that we saw inside Team Server. And then likewise for our physical model, we've got our schemas, and we can break down the schemas, see the tables and the columns. Again, all with the properties. If we click on each of these that we've mapped in Team Server settings. If a table doesn't have a schema, then you'll see it at the top level here. EMP load is not part of a schema. So that's the integration between Team Server and Collibra. So we saw how we could set up the integration, map properties and relationships of business terms. We then saw how we could map properties for our ER objects and then publish to Collibra and set the publishing frequencies. Thanks very much for watching.